Hello and welcome back to a new review. Today I'm going to be talking about an artist who I've spent a lot of time sort of tiptoeing around over the course of doing this channel. I think I've reviewed him once, but that was a long time ago and it wasn't one of his better albums. So, whereas today I'm going to be talking about an album that is one of my absolute favorites. And I think it's an album a lot of people really like. But I rate it maybe a little higher than a lot of Bowie fans maybe do, and that is Diamond Dogs from 1974. This is the end of his glam period. He's dumped the Spiders from Mars by this point. You know, the Ziggy era is over. He's killed off the Ziggy Stardust character. He kind of sort of has a character. People have called this era of Bowie, I believe, Halloween Jack or something to that effect. Blame me alive in the comments if I got that wrong. I'm running with no notes tonight, people, so you can have a video this week. Anyway, basically this is his dark, grimy apocalypse album. The first of two, actually, oddly enough, you know, because Outside is sort of, in a way, Outside is like Diamond Dogs 2, or Diamond Dogs 3, if you want to count Station to Station as being somewhere in there too, you know, but definitely, you know, dark, dystopian future, you know. You know, it was the 70s. Everybody thought the world was going to end in the 70s. You know, people today, we all talk about, oh, you know, climate change is gonna ravage the land. You know, we're all going to be living in domes, breathing out of machines in 20 years if human life exists at all. People were talking about it in the 70s too. In fact, I find that aspect of 70s pop culture is kind of like understated in younger people like myself's perception of the decade now. Like, it was such a huge part of the glam thing, especially Bowie's glam thing, you know, the whole you best get down because there might not be a tomorrow element of it. And this is very much in tune with that. It's a weird one for a lot of different reasons. This is where the cocaine really started to have an effect on the music. This is the first one where you listen to it and you're like, this man is on a lot of drugs. It's also much more theatrical than any of the glam albums besides, I would say, the original Ziggy Stardust. Because at one point he was going to do a full-blown 1984 musical, or he wanted to do a full-blown 1984 musical, that George Orwell's estate, I believe, put the kibosh on. And only a little bit of that worked its way onto the album. There's a bunch of stuff on side 2 that was a part of that, you know, stuff like 1984, obviously, Big Brother, and I think maybe Chant of the Ever-Circling Skeletal Family was originally going to be part of that. But the rest of it is new stuff, more or less. Some of it was worked up with the Spiders from Mars. But the important thing, I think, for a lot of people, and this is a weird thing, is that this is Bowie's Doing It Himself album. This is the one where he plays all the guitar himself, so there's a rawness to this that is not on the other glam albums. It's also the one where a lot gets stripped back, you know. It's where the heritage of glam era Bowie really sort of gets put on display, and you understand, like, oh yeah, no, this guy adored the Rolling Stones in the 60s. But not the Rolling Stones in the 60s that people necessarily romanticized, but the sort of mercenary swinging London pop band that the Rolling Stones were in the 60s. I mean, something like Rebel Rebel is one of the greatest one riff songs ever written since Satisfaction. Anyway, like I was saying, weird, theatrical, future legend, weird spoken word. Segueing into the first actual song with the iconic line, "This ain't rock and roll, this is genocide." Diamond Dogs, great, sounds like the Rolling Stones. Sweet Thing is phenomenal. It's a little mini suite type deal, goes into a bit of an interlude bit. There's some incredibly moody piano stuff, great vocal work, and then it reprises and goes into Rebel Rebel, which is, of course, phenomenal track. It's weird. It's one of those hits where, for a more modern example of this, I always jump to Daft Punk's Get Lucky, a track that is kind of annoying in isolation. I'm not a huge fan of Rebel Rebel by itself, but in the context of the album, it really shines, and it's a phenomenal way to end side one. But then you open up side two with Rock and Roll With Me, which is blatantly a Rolling Stones style ballad. Like, you could have heard a better version of this on some of their contemporary albums, but it flows into maybe my favorite David Bowie track from the 70s. Then I don't know if this is something a lot of people agree on or not. It probably isn't. We Are the Dead, which is just so weird. It's so coked out and spooky and kind of creepy at times, where he's talking about dancing where the dogs decay and that sort of thing. The choruses, if you can call them that, are almost more like rants than actual choruses. It reminds me a lot of Small Plot of Land from Outside in that sense. Outside very much channels a lot of the weirdness that you have on this album, but it makes it even weirder, which is why, Outside is one of my favorite albums by him too. And then you get 1984, which really points forward to Young Americans. Great sort of plastic soul thing happening there. And then Big Brother, amazing, wonderful lyrics on that. And then the dance of the ever-chanting, or the chant of the ever-circling skeletal family. I always forget how that title goes. It's something about circling skeletal families. That's a great track too, especially the way it ends with that effect that makes it sound like the record is skipping, and it just closes out the album on a suitably bizarre note. And there's a lot of conceptual stuff I've left out too, the stuff about his character living on top of Manhattan Chase and the Diamond Dogs, which I think he envisioned as a sort of bizarre futuristic street gang on roller skates or something to that effect, something ridiculous. Bowie interviews in the 70s are always a trip because he's talking about incredibly bizarre stuff. Unless you're listening to the Station to Station era interviews where he's basically being a fascist, because that's what the Thin White Duke was. But so yeah, a really, really good album. This review is kind of concise, and I wish I could give it a little more time, and I probably will give it a little more time at some point. Maybe a fuller review, more in depth, something with a little more production. But this is basically, Weekly Album Spotlight, talking to you about one of my favorite albums. Like I was saying earlier, the rawness is fun. The fact that he did it all himself, for the most part. Outside of Tony Visconti, there's nobody here from the old days for the most part, and it's one of the very few albums you can point to with Bowie and say he did this, as opposed to Brian Eno did this, or Carlos Alomar did this, or Reeves Gabrels did this, or any of his other later collaborators, you know, because he worked with other people his whole career, and, you know, sometimes the thread between Bowie albums is not as clean and defined as one would sometimes like it to be. You know, I find that people who have very defined ideas about ownership and I find that people who have really defined ideas about authorship in music and the sort of the purity of vision and the artist as the speaker who projects truth and some manifestation of the self into the world. People who place a really high premium on that sort of thing tend to struggle with Bowie. In my experience, you know, even if they have a grudging respect for him, there's always a caveat somewhere, and I think it's probably impossible to love him as an artist if you can't get over that sort of thing. I can, because I'm a big fan of old school pop, and to an extent modern pop as well, and very few of those people wrote their own songs. It's also not coincidental that David Bowie is the only rock and roll singer from the 70s I can think of who could make a Frank Sinatra song sound good, but I've rambled quite a bit in this video, so I will see you all next time.